He arrived in Blackwood without a name, without a title, and without a past. But the words he whispered to Seraphina Thorne's sister before he left would haunt the aristocrats of this town until their dying breath. No one believed that a man could dismantle a century of power with just a few secrets. Yet before the night was over, the Thorne family would realize that some debts are paid not with gold, but with total ruin. This is not just a story of a stranger. It is the story of how the foundation of an entire legacy turned to dust. The black carriage sliced through the thick, suffocating mist that clung to the isolated town of Blackwood like a burial shroud, leaving a trail of churned mud and oppressive silence in its wake. Kaelen Ashwood descended from the vehicle with deliberate, fluid movements, pulling his charcoal-colored wool coat tight against the biting autumnal wind, while local residents peered from behind heavy velvet curtains, their breath fogging the glass in anticipation of the unknown. He carried no coat of arms, no signet ring, and offered no name to the innkeeper, clutching only a worn leather satchel that seemed to house burdens far heavier than mere gold or parchment. His sudden appearance in the central square sent a ripple of visceral unease through the local aristocracy, who viewed his lack of title as an affront to the rigid social order they had cultivated for centuries. Kaelen walked with the terrifying composure of a man who navigated forbidden paths by moonlight, pointedly ignoring the disparaging glares and the frantic, whispered interrogations from those desperate to categorize his origin. Every measured step he took upon the uneven cobblestones resonated like a final tolling bell, signaling an irrevocable shift in the town's destiny that no one present was prepared to endure. As twilight bled into a bruised purple, the stranger directed his path toward the most secluded boarding house in the valley, a crumbling structure where discretion was the only currency that held any real value. The proprietor, a man who habitually avoided all interaction with travelers, felt a frigid shiver cascade down his spine upon recording the entry of his guest. A man whose vacant, predatory gaze suggested someone who sought no respite, but rather a final, bloody reckoning with fate. The stage was meticulously set, and in their collective hubris, the inhabitants of that stagnant town had inadvertently invited a catalyst of total collapse into their fragile reality. If you love stories where mystery and justice collide within the aristocracy, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss a single turn of this epic downfall. Within the sprawling, opulent halls of Thorne Manor, rumors regarding the stranger circulated with the frantic intensity of wildfire, eventually reaching the ears of Seraphina Thorne, while she attempted to maintain a facade of serenity during her afternoon tea service. She possessed an intuitive understanding that names, within their suffocating sphere of lineage and inheritance, acted as either unbreakable shields or lethal blades, and a man who deliberately discarded his identity was a volatile variable that could not be suppressed by social etiquette alone. The tension saturated the grand parlor, where every fragile clatter of bone china against silver seemed deafening, perfectly mirroring the mounting anxiety that gripped the young heiress's soul. Kaelen Ashwood, meanwhile, occupied his sequestered room by meticulously analyzing centuries-old cadastral maps of the region, hunting for a specific irregularity that had been erased from official records through generations of calculated deception. He had not arrived in Blackwood by some whim of travel or navigational error. Every minute detail of the township had been researched with surgical precision months in advance, ensuring that no social barrier or physical obstacle could impede his relentless pursuit. The enigma surrounding his lack of a name was merely the outermost layer of a far more intricate puzzle. A dark history protected by wax seals that Kaelen was prepared to shatter, regardless of the cost. The stranger's silence served as his most potent instrument of psychological manipulation, forcing those around him to project their deepest insecurities and buried shames onto the empty vessel of his identity. Individuals who dared to approach him were met with monosyllabic retorts and glacial, observant stares that effectively incinerated any spark of curiosity before it could gain momentum. Yet, what the inhabitants failed to discern was that Kaelen's profound silence was a deliberate confession of a trauma so absolute that it could not be articulated even under the most extreme duress of their questioning. Seraphina Thorne was navigating the treacherous outskirts of her family's estate, seeking the suffocating sanctuary of the ancient thicket to escape the relentless expectations of her kin, when she stumbled upon Kaelen standing motionless beside a petrified oak tree. He seemed to manifest from the landscape itself, unnaturally still, surveying the sprawling manor in the distance, as if he were methodically identifying every structural and moral weakness in the family's legacy. The encounter was seemingly serendipitous, yet for Kaelen, the timing possessed the cold, mechanical precision of a master tactician anticipating the final, checkmating move of his adversary. Seraphina's mare reared in sudden terror at his proximity, compelling the young woman to exhibit a level of masterful control that the nobility deemed unseemly for one of her delicate constitution. Upon subduing the animal, she locked her piercing emerald gaze with his, anticipating the predictable arrogance characteristic of the men within her circle. Yet she was met only with a chilling, detached emptiness that left her profoundly unnerved. Kaelen offered no customary nod of deference, nor did he avert his eyes in a display of subservience, remaining steadfast in his posture of an outsider who refused to acknowledge the hollow authority of their ancient titles. "These grounds are strictly private, sir," Seraphina stated, struggling to maintain the brittle composure of her station, while her heart hammered against her ribs like a frantic trapped bird. He stepped closer, and the very atmosphere of the thicket seemed to bow before the inherent dark authority radiating from him, a power that drew no strength from land or inheritance, but from an internal, jagged resolve. Before departing, Kaelen murmured a cryptic phrase concerning the manor's buried foundations, leaving Seraphina frozen in the mud with a revelation she was never meant to hear, successfully implanting the seeds of an existential doubt that could never again be uprooted. Isolde Thorne observed the entire encounter from the fractured glass of the attic window, her fingers clawing into the delicate lace of her bodice with such ferocity that her knuckles bled white. She witnessed the stranger. She watched her sister's distress, and she felt the crushing gravity of a clandestine secret that threatened to incinerate the reputation the family had fabricated through decades of meticulous, deceitful labor. The ravenous curiosity in her eyes was inextricably bound to a paralyzing terror, for she understood, better than any other living soul, the catastrophic consequences if their long-interred past chose to emerge and demand its full interest. The stranger did not merely observe. He functioned as an external force of nature on the precipice of dismantling the intricate clockwork of their household, and Isolde felt each of his deliberate movements as a silent, existential alarm. She recognized that Seraphina possessed a resilience that was often underestimated, yet the fortitude required to endure whatever truth Kaelen brought into their lives was beyond the scope of anything either sister had ever confronted. The elaborate masquerade of Blackwood was rapidly approaching its final act, and Isolde's absolute, horrified silence was the ultimate testament to her comprehension of the impending ruin. While Seraphina slowly navigated the return path to the manor, Isolde retreated into the suffocating darkness of the attic, desperately concealing a leather-bound diary that contained the uncensored records of the events the family had labored to erase from memory. The secret that bound the stranger to her bloodline acted like a slow-acting poison, saturating the floorboards and corridors of the manor, transforming every opulent chamber into a waiting cell for the inevitable, brutal conclusion. She offered no warning to the others, yet the crushing weight of her silence was a desperate, unheard prayer for a survival that felt increasingly like a grotesque impossibility. The evening banquet within the grand dining hall of Thorne Manor was suffocated by a glacial atmosphere, where the only audible disturbances were the rhythmic, icy clinks of silver against fine porcelain. Kaelen Ashwood materialized without an invitation, his mere presence functioning as a harbinger of cataclysm, flagrantly violating etiquette by claiming the head of the table as if he were the rightful architect of that estate. The eyes of Julian Vane, who sat among the guests, ignited with a raw, impotent rage at the sight of the intruder who threatened to collapse the fragile scaffolding of his influence and social standing. Seraphina attempted to sustain a thread of polite conversation, offering trivial observations about the harvest that were surgically dismantled by Kaelen's biting, refined irony, which stripped away the veneer of her courtesy with terrifying ease. He had not journeyed to Blackwood for pleasantries or social integration. He had arrived to peel back the layers of the family's putrefaction, testing the loyalties of every person in that hall through the weaponization of truths that had been buried in shallow graves. The environment mimicked the moments before a catastrophic storm, where each sentence was a lightning strike, threatening to tear asunder the walls of their meticulously constructed lie. The tension achieved a nauseating zenith when Kaelen referenced a forgotten tragedy, asserting that it served as the definitive explanation for why the Thorne family now resided within walls that could not contain the echoes of the blood they had spilled. Julian Vane rose to his feet, his limbs trembling with an uncontainable, murderous fury, but the stranger merely offered a thin, mirthless smile that effectively froze the oxygen in the room. At that precise juncture, Seraphina grasped the horrifying reality that the man's arrival was not merely a tragic coincidence, but the opening movement of an inevitable descent that she was utterly powerless to arrest. Julian Vane believed he was in control, but he had no idea the stranger already held the final piece of the puzzle. What happened in the library that night would alter the Thorne family's destiny forever. The morning after the banquet, an intangible heaviness settled over the town, as if the very oxygen had become saturated with the suffocating weight of unvoiced accusations. While the servants performed their morning duties, they exchanged frantic, wide-eyed glances, sensing that the fragile social hierarchy of Blackwood was fracturing under the unspoken pressure of Kaelen's presence. Seraphina moved through the corridors like a ghost, haunted by the realization that the stranger had stripped away the illusion of their security, leaving them exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of scrutiny. Kaelen remained within the shadows of the local archives, his eyes scanning dusty, moth-eaten ledgers that detailed land transactions dating back over a century. He moved with a predatory focus, ignoring the occasional inquisitive glances of the archivist, who was too frightened to question the man's unauthorized access to restricted documents. Every piece of information he unearthed was like a jagged piece of a mosaic, slowly revealing a portrait of treachery that the town's elite had collectively labored to erase from the collective memory. Julian Vane, realizing the danger Kaelen posed, spent his hours mobilizing his remaining influence to cast doubt upon the stranger's sanity. He whispered poison into the ears of the local constabulary, attempting to paint Kaelen as a dangerous vagrant whose presence threatened the town's prosperity. However, as the secret of the stranger's investigation began to seep into the community's consciousness, a palpable sense of dread took root, proving that the truth was no longer contained within the walls of Thorne Manor. Isolde Thorne found it increasingly difficult to maintain her composure, her nerves fraying under the relentless observation of her sister, who sensed that something monumental was being withheld. She spent her afternoons meticulously destroying old letters that threatened to expose the fragility of their family's standing, her movements sharp and desperate. The stranger's mere existence acted as an unwelcome mirror, reflecting the ugly, desperate reality of what the Thorne family had sacrificed to climb the ladder of aristocracy. She attempted to confront Kaelen in the courtyard, her voice trembling with a mixture of defiance and genuine, paralyzing fear. She demanded to know his true intentions, hoping that a show of authority would force him to reveal the scope of his knowledge. But Kaelen merely offered a mocking, slow smile that dismissed her posturing entirely. He understood that Isolde was the architect of the family's most recent deceptions, and his refusal to engage in her games was the most potent weapon he possessed. The encounter left Isolde reeling, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she retreated into the safety of the parlor, feeling entirely powerless for the first time in her life. She understood now that this wasn't merely a matter of social standing or wealth, but a battle for their continued survival in a world that would show them no mercy if the truth were fully unveiled. Every shadow within the manor now seemed to harbor an enemy, and she was forced to recognize that the protection she once enjoyed was rapidly dissolving into dust. Seraphina sat before her vanity, staring at her reflection and failing to recognize the woman peering back, the daughter of a prestigious family now forced to confront the potential for total ruin. She felt a profound, aching pull toward the stranger, an irrational fascination with the raw, uncompromising truth he represented, despite the devastation he threatened to bring upon her kin. This inner turmoil tore her apart, forcing her to choose between the comfortable lies of her upbringing and the dangerous, volatile reality of a man who held their lives in his palms. She wandered through the moonlit gardens, hoping the cooling air would calm the tempest of her thoughts, only to encounter Kaelen again near the hedge maze. He watched her with a complexity that belied his earlier detachment, as if he were measuring her capacity for moral courage against the crushing weight of her family's history. There were no words exchanged, only a heavy, charged silence that spoke more eloquently than any declaration, forcing Seraphina to reckon with her own complicity in the silence that had reigned for so long. The internal struggle intensified until she felt as though she were living two distinct lives, one of forced propriety and another of dawning, terrifying awareness of her family's past transgressions. Kaelen's presence was a clarion call to action, demanding that she acknowledge the blood-stained foundation of her privilege, even if it meant destroying the very world that had nurtured her. She finally understood that silence was no longer a viable sanctuary, and that the coming reckoning would require a courage she was not yet certain she possessed. As the first rays of the morning sun pierced the thick morning fog, Kaelen stood upon the terrace, finding Seraphina waiting for him with a look of resolute determination. The air between them was thick with anticipation, and the words that were about to be spoken would forever alter the precarious trajectory of their lives. He finally chose to speak, his voice low and vibrating with a long-suppressed anger, detailing the specific acts of betrayal that had allowed the Thorne family to ascend to their current status. The forbidden words hung in the air, each syllable acting as a hammer blow against the pedestal upon which her family stood, shattering every remaining delusion of their innocence. Seraphina listened, her features pale and rigid, unable to refute the evidence Kaelen presented, the dates, the names, the calculated ruin of others to ensure their own prosperity. Every detail he provided was an indelible mark upon her conscience, ensuring she could never again view her home as a place of refuge or honor. When he finished, a profound silence followed, heavy with the weight of the realization that there was no way to return to the life they had previously occupied. Seraphina looked at him, not with the hatred she had been groomed to feel for their enemies, but with a terrifying, blossoming empathy for the man who had suffered at her family's hands. The dawn had not brought light, but the exposure of a reality so jagged that it threatened to cut them both to pieces. Kaelen walked away, Leaving Seraphina alone on the terrace to grapple with the realization that the promise he had made to himself, to destroy the Thorne legacy, was now a reality she had to navigate. The burden of this truth felt physical, a crushing weight that made each step toward the manor feel as though she were marching toward her own execution. She recognized that the life of comfort she had known was an illusion sustained by the suffering of others, a debt that was finally being called to be paid in full. She retreated to her chambers, where she found her sister frantically searching for missing documents, their lives clearly diverging as the truth began to solidify around them. The contrast between their reactions was stark. While Seraphina felt the crushing need to seek some form of restitution, Isolde was spiraling deeper into a desperate, chaotic need to protect the status quo at all costs. The family, once unified by their secret, was now being torn apart by the very reality that Kaelen had brought into their home. As the day progressed, Seraphina understood that the unfulfilled promises of the past were now manifesting in the present, demanding a sacrifice that would leave nothing of their former lives intact. She sat in her room, watching the town of Blackwood below, realizing that the coming chaos would be total, and that the only remaining choice was whether to be swept away by the tide or to attempt to navigate the destruction toward some semblance of redemption. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would test the very limits of honor and truth. The tension is only beginning, and the truth about the Thorne family's past will shake the very social foundations of Blackwood. Don't be left behind. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The decision materialized within Seraphina's mind with the chilling clarity of a winter morning, an understanding that she could no longer inhabit the gilded cage of her father's manor without forfeiting her own integrity. She spent the small hours of the night gathering only the barest essentials, discarding the fine silks and heirloom jewels that felt like tangible manifestations of her family's illicit fortune. Every object she left behind was a silent rejection of the comfort bought at the expense of others, a deliberate act of stripping away the identity she had been forced to cultivate since childhood. As the manor slept, she moved through the drafty corridors, the floorboards creaking under her boots like rhythmic, warning heartbeats that echoed the magnitude of her departure. She reached the foyer, pausing for a final moment to observe the portraits of her ancestors, recognizing now that their stern gazes were not symbols of noble tradition, but masks of greed that had dictated the ruin of many before her. Stepping out into the biting chill of the night, Seraphina inhaled the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, feeling a terrifying, exhilarating lightness as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, sealing her former life into the past. The carriage she had arranged stood waiting at the edge of the Thorne estate, the horses shifting restlessly in the dark, their breath visible in the freezing air like spectral wisps. She did not glance back at the looming silhouette of her home, nor did she allow the flicker of doubt regarding the uncertainty of her path to impede her resolve. She was no longer a Thorne, but a woman walking into the unknown in search of a justice that could not be legislated. As the vehicle lurched forward, its wheels grinding against the gravel, Seraphina felt the last remnants of her status dissolving into the mist, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a burning, singular purpose. The next morning, the household awoke to a vacuum where Seraphina had once anchored the fragile stability of their public image, a void so profound it seemed to pull the breath from the very lungs of the manor. Isolde paced the main hallway, her composure finally eroding into frantic, whispered commands to the staff to find her sister. Yet her eyes revealed that she harbored no real hope of Seraphina's return. The silence that settled over the breakfast table was not merely the absence of speech, but a heavy, pulsating presence that demanded an explanation no one dared to articulate. For to speak of Seraphina's departure was to invite the interrogation of her reasons. Julian Vane arrived at midday, his face a mask of calculated fury as he paced the study, demanding that the search for the missing heiress be conducted with extreme discretion to avoid alerting the gossiping masses of Blackwood. He viewed Seraphina's flight not as an act of moral rebellion, but as a catastrophic disruption to the intricate web of alliances he had spent years securing through the Thorne family's influence. His agitation was palpable, vibrating through the room as he contemplated the potential damage to his reputation, yet he remained entirely oblivious to the fact that the silence of the household was a symptom of a far more terminal disease already ravaging the foundations of their power. Meanwhile, the servants moved with exaggerated care, their eyes downcast to avoid the volatile gaze of their masters, sensing that the manor had become a hollow vessel of authority that could no longer command genuine obedience. They discussed the heiress in hushed tones behind the heavy velvet drapes of the kitchens, acknowledging the significance of her disappearance as the ultimate cracks appearing in a fortress previously considered invincible. The silence grew suffocating, acting as a pressurized chamber where the collective fear of the residents was slowly intensifying, awaiting only the slightest spark to ignite an explosion of long-buried secrets. What Seraphina discovered while sifting through her family's private records was the catalyst that sealed their fate. Nobody in that hall was prepared for the revelation she was about to unleash. Kaelen Ashwood stood on the outskirts of the town square, watching the frantic activity at Thorne Manor from a distance, with the dispassionate focus of a commander evaluating the field of battle. He noted the arrival of Julian Vane's men and the subsequent departures of search parties, recognizing that his presence had catalyzed the exact reaction he had calculated. The exposure of their desperation. He did not intervene, nor did he display any outward sign of satisfaction. He remained a stoic sentinel of impending justice, allowing the fear he had instilled to do the majority of his work for him. He began to systematically circulate among the local merchants and laborers, not by asking direct questions, but by planting small, targeted inquiries that would lead the most inquisitive minds to the documents he had already exposed within the archives. Kaelen functioned as a master puppeteer, understanding that if the people of Blackwood were allowed to uncover the depth of their own exploitation, the collapse of the Thornes would be organic and irreversible. His role had shifted from a mere investigator to an orchestrator of societal decay, a man who required no violence to dismantle the structures of an empire that had been built upon the suffering of the common folk. As evening descended, Kaelen returned to the boarding house, where the proprietor now treated him with a trembling, wary reverence, refusing to make eye contact as he handed over the key to his room. Kaelen ignored the fear, his mind entirely focused on the next sequence of events that would force Julian Vane to publicly acknowledge the ruin that was currently being orchestrated in the dark. He was not merely waiting for the collapse. He was ensuring that when it finally occurred, no stone of the old order would remain standing to support the weight of the past's treachery. The news of Seraphina's departure, combined with the mysterious influence of the stranger, rippled through the town of Blackwood like a seismic wave, destabilizing the social order that had been in place for generations. Conversations in the taverns and markets no longer centered on the harvest or the weather, but on the Thorne family's crumbling veneer of respectability and the unknown foreigner who moved through their streets like a harbinger of doom. The atmosphere was charged with a volatile mixture of hope and terror, as the common folk began to realize that their oppressors were not the untouchable titans they had once perceived them to be. Small acts of defiance began to emerge. Merchants refused to grant the usual lines of credit to the manor's representatives, and the laborers, once terrified of Julian Vane's influence, now met his overseers with stony, unyielding gazes. The town was undergoing a metamorphosis, shifting from a collection of compliant subjects into a community that was beginning to recognize its own collective potential for reclamation. Every aspect of Blackwood's daily life was becoming a battlefield, where the traditional power dynamics were being challenged not by open rebellion, but by the subtle, crushing weight of communal withdrawal. Julian Vane, attempting to maintain control through intimidation, found his tactics failing as his threats were met with increasing indifference and, at times, open derision from those he had once controlled. He realized that the town's respect had been entirely predicated on the fear of the Thorne name, and with that name currently mired in whispers of scandal and uncertainty, his authority was evaporating like dew under the heat of the sun. The turmoil was absolute, a total dissolution of the status quo that left Julian grasping at the air, desperately attempting to stop a tide that had already swallowed his foundations. The town is on the brink of an explosion, and the revelations to come are unprecedented. Ensure you are subscribed to witness the exact moment the elite of Blackwood finally fall. Kaelen Ashwood returned to the archives at midnight, utilizing a master key he had acquired to bypass the heavy iron locks, his objective being the final, damning evidence required to irrevocably link Julian Vane to the illicit land seizures of the last century. The air inside was stiflingly dry, smelling of ancient parchment and decay, but Kaelen moved with a surgical intensity, his lantern casting long, dancing shadows against the rows of shelves that stretched into the darkness. He had narrowed his search to a small, overlooked drawer hidden behind the primary filing cabinets, a space that clearly had not been opened in decades, containing the authentic records that Julian believed had been burned long ago. His fingers brushed against the rough surface of an old ledger, and he pulled it forth with a sense of grim, inevitable triumph. The weight of the book confirming the presence of the long-lost documents he had theorized existed. As he flipped through the pages, the full scope of the Thorne family's systemic theft became clear. A history of forged signatures, manipulated court decisions, and the cold-blooded displacement of families who had held those lands for centuries. Each entry was a confession, a detailed record of the avarice that had fueled the family's rise, now sitting firmly within his grasp to be used as the ultimate weapon. Leaving the archives, Kaelen felt a cold, hard resolve solidify within him, the kind of purpose that allowed no space for hesitation or regret. He had the truth, and he possessed the means to ensure that it would reach the ears of those who had the most to lose, effectively stripping Julian Vane of the last remnants of his social defense. The investigation was complete. The architecture of the Thorne downfall was finalized, and as he stepped back out into the cool night air, he knew that the following morning would be the final reckoning for the man who had stolen so much from so many. As the morning market began to bustle, Kaelen Ashwood positioned himself in the center of the town plaza, clutching the weathered ledger he had retrieved from the archives the previous night. He did not shout or resort to histrionics. Instead, he opened the tome and began to read aloud the specific, recorded instances of the Thorne family's land seizures, his voice carrying clearly across the expectant silence of the gathered townspeople. The revelation struck the assembly with the weight of physical force, as individuals recognized the names of their own ancestors within the ledger's damning entries, transforming the historical facts into a visceral, communal trauma that demanded immediate justice. Julian Vane, alerted by the sudden concentrated murmur of the crowd, pushed his way through the perimeter of the plaza, his face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and frantic, unadulterated rage. He attempted to dismiss the ledger as a collection of fabrications. Yet his hesitation, combined with the specificity of the dates and locations Kaelen presented, served only to confirm his guilt in the eyes of the populace. The townspeople, once immobilized by the myth of Thorne invincibility, now regarded Julian with a cold, unrelenting hostility that signaled the final dissolution of his social authority. The plaza transformed into a crucible of accountability, where the long-suppressed resentment of generations found its focal point in the pages Kaelen presented. Julian found himself surrounded, not by soldiers or hired hands, but by the very people he had marginalized, their gazes reflecting a collective demand for an accounting that could no longer be deferred or negotiated away. The past was no longer a ghost haunting the Thorne family. It had become an inescapable, material reality standing in the center of the square. And for the first time, Julian realized he had run out of avenues for escape. Public humiliation was only the beginning. When Kaelen's true identity was finally revealed in the plaza, Julian realized there was nowhere left to run. Isolde Thorne watched the scene from the safety of a second-story window, her breath hitching as she witnessed the irreversible collapse of her family's standing among the local elite. She felt the panic of a drowning woman, recognizing that Julian's public humiliation was the harbinger of her own, and that the resources she had desperately tried to hoard were becoming increasingly worthless in the wake of the public exposure. She was paralyzed by a profound, agonizing dilemma, whether to publicly disavow her brother to preserve a shred of her own reputation, or to remain bound to his inevitable descent into total ruin. She considered the letters she had destroyed, wondering if there was any remaining evidence that could be used to shift the culpability entirely onto Julian's shoulders. The isolation of her position became absolute. She realized that her social circle had already begun to distance itself, and the once loyal staff of the manor were now observing her with open, mocking derision. Her internal conflict was a reflection of the family's moral bankruptcy, as she understood that their survival had always been predicated on the betrayal of others, and now that betrayal was finally turning inward. The weight of the dilemma crushed her resolve, leading her to make a desperate, clandestine attempt to contact the local magistrates, seeking any form of immunity in exchange for testifying against her brother's specific, documented crimes. This final act of cowardice, born from a desperate, selfish survival instinct, was the ultimate confirmation of the Thorne family's total collapse of character. Isolde sat in the darkening parlor, aware that she was selling out her own blood to buy a few extra days of relative comfort, a choice that left her utterly hollow and devoid of any remaining pretense of honor. Julian Vane retreated from the plaza to the sanctuary of the Thorne study, but the sanctuary had been breached by the cold reality of his public exposure. He paced the room, the grandeur of the surroundings now feeling like a tomb, as he contemplated the speed with which his influence had evaporated into nothingness. He realized that his power had never been real. It had been a collective hallucination sustained by the town's fear, and Kaelen Ashwood had successfully forced the town to awaken from that slumber. His composure, which he had practiced for years as an impenetrable armor, was now visibly disintegrating, his movements erratic and his speech a disorganized stream of defiance and self-pity. He attempted to dictate a series of letters to his remaining contacts in the city, but the scribes he summoned refused to enter the manor, sensing that the Thorne name had become a poison they could no longer risk associating with. The isolation of the manor was complete. Julian was finally confronting the reality of his own mediocrity, stripped of the status that had served as the only defining feature of his existence. The mask he had worn, of a stern, paternal protector of the Thorne legacy, was now a shredded remnant of a past that no longer held any power. Every piece of art, every fine chair, and every expensive carpet now seemed to mock him, serving as reminders of the lives he had ruined to acquire them. As the evening shadows deepened, Julian found himself trapped not by the physical walls of the manor, but by the relentless, encroaching darkness of his own history, finally catching up to him with a finality that brooked no further negotiation, Kaelen Ashwood ascended the front steps of Thorne Manor as the full moon cast a stark, silver pallor over the estate, his entry unimpeded by the staff who had long since abandoned their posts. He moved through the familiar, opulent corridors with the silence of a predator, finding Julian in the study, his back to the door, staring into the flickering embers of a dying fireplace. The silence between them wasn't filled with the anticipation of a debate, but with the inevitable conclusion of a process that had begun the moment Kaelen first set foot in Blackwood. Julian turned, his face showing the exhaustion of a man who had finally surrendered to the inevitability of his own destruction. Kaelen did not speak. He only placed the ledger on the heavy mahogany desk, the sound echoing like a gavel striking a block in a courtroom that had already reached its verdict. He observed the way Julian's eyes traveled over the pages, seeing the historical truth of his family's crimes finally articulated in cold, unyielding ink, an exposure that rendered every lie he had ever told entirely futile. The confrontation was brief and devastating. There were no grand speeches, for the reality of the Thorne family's history required no further embellishment to reach its conclusion. Julian slumped into his chair, the weight of his family's sins finally crushing the pretense of his authority, leaving him as nothing more than a broken man defined by the ruin he had caused. Kaelen watched him, feeling no elation, only the grim, hollow satisfaction of an obligation finally discharged, knowing that the man before him was already a relic of a past that would never be permitted to return. In the final tense moments of their interaction, Kaelen moved closer to the desk, his presence finally forcing Julian to confront the individual he had harmed the most. He began to reveal his true identity, a name that Julian had attempted to purge from all records, the survivor of the very first family the Thornes had systematically destroyed to secure their early prominence. The revelation of his lineage was the final blow. Julian understood now that his opponent was not merely a random investigator, but the manifestation of the family's original, foundational sin, returned to close the circle of his own making. The name Kaelen spoke carried with it the history of the families he had been born to defend, now articulated with the cold, precise intent of a man who had dedicated his entire existence to this singular transformative moment. Julian's disbelief curdled into a realization of the poetic, inescapable nature of his collapse. He was being destroyed by the very injustice he had presumed was forgotten. The cycle was complete, the debts were being settled, and the Thorne name was finally being erased from the social fabric of Blackwood, exactly as it had been written into existence. Kaelen turned to leave, his task accomplished, the final secret exposed, and the Thorne authority definitively shattered. Julian remained motionless in the study, the ledger open before him, surrounded by the remnants of a legacy that had been built on a foundation of sand, finally collapsing into the ruins he had created. As Kaelen exited the manor, the cool night air felt different, the burden he had carried for decades finally lifting, leaving him in a world where the future was no longer written by the crimes of the past. Even as the Thorne legacy dissolved, Isolde's final, desperate gamble reached fruition as she delivered a cache of forged documents to the local magistrate, hoping to frame Julian for crimes they had both committed together. Her betrayal was surgical in its precision, aiming to save her own inheritance by casting her brother as the sole architect of the family's moral rot. The townspeople, who had gathered in the plaza hoping for a unified collapse of the Thorne influence, were stunned to witness the siblings turning against one another in a final, frantic struggle for survival that stripped away any remaining veneer of familial loyalty. The magistrate, having already heard Kaelen's testimony and reviewed the authentic ledger, saw through Isolde's transparent attempt to shift the blame, further isolating her as the last defender of an indefensible legacy. Her panic deepened as she realized that her calculated move had backfired, turning the public's moderate pity for a fallen family into a sharp, unyielding disgust. She stood alone on the steps of the courthouse, the very social architecture she had desperately fought to preserve now turning against her with the weight of its collective resentment. Julian, observing this final betrayal from the confines of the manor, felt a strange, detached clarity, realizing that the house of cards he had built was being dismantled from within by the same forces of greed that had created it. He offered no defense for his sister, nor did he attempt to clear his own name, as the reality of their mutual destruction finally permeated his consciousness. The betrayal was the final, inevitable movement in their undoing, a testament to the fact that those who lived by treachery could only end by consuming one another. While the Thornes imploded, a ghost from the town's history, the elderly patriarch of the family Kaelen's ancestors had displaced, returned to Blackwood to witness the end of the line that had stolen his future. His presence was quiet, a haunting reminder of the intergenerational suffering that Kaelen's crusade had finally brought to the surface for all to see. He did not seek vengeance, but merely the closure that had eluded his people for over a century, finding a somber peace in the sight of the Thorne Manor's crumbling authority. His arrival acted as a catalyst for the final emotional dismantling of the Thorne family's remaining influence. As the local elders recognized him as Kaelen's grandfather, the sole survivor of the bloodline the Thornes had attempted to extinguish a century ago, his presence triggered harrowing memories of the town's original sin in every household. The shadow he cast was long, and in his quiet, dignified observation, the townspeople found the final confirmation that the current downfall was not merely a modern accident, but a long-overdue restoration of balance. He became a living testament to the endurance of those who had been discarded, and as Kaelen's own flesh and blood, his silent witness proved far more devastating than any courtroom testimony could ever be. Kaelen encountered the old man in the park, the two of them sharing a silent, knowing nod that acknowledged the conclusion of a story that had begun long before their time. It was a moment of profound, quiet restoration, where the pain of the past was finally allowed to recede, no longer governing the trajectory of the town's future. As the sun set behind the trees, the old man slowly walked away, his mission of witnessing the end complete, leaving Blackwood to breathe for the first time in generations without the stifling presence of the Thorne legacy. The arrival of the town's eldest patriarch in the park brought a truth that no ledger could capture. What he whispered to Kaelen on that garden bench shattered everything we thought we knew about this game of vengeance. During the initial search of the manor, Seraphina, now living in humble exile, discovered a hidden, dust-covered chest in the attic, containing a final, unsent letter written by her mother. This document, which had been concealed for decades, contained a frantic warning about the true, malicious origins of the Thorne fortune, and a plea for her children to renounce the family name before it was too late. Reading the frantic, ink-stained lines, Seraphina felt a crushing sense of inevitability, realizing that her parents had been aware of their moral precariousness all along, yet chose to prioritize the acquisition of status over the survival of their own integrity. The letter also revealed that her mother had intended to help the displaced families regain their rights, but had been suppressed by Julian, who had viewed such an act as a fatal threat to their standing. This disclosure reframed Seraphina's understanding of her upbringing, transforming her parents from mere villains into victims of the very ambition that had eventually claimed their children. The letter acted as a final, bittersweet reconciliation with a mother she had never truly known, offering her the missing context that had haunted her entire existence. Armed with this evidence, Seraphina understood that she possessed the key to finalizing the restoration of the land, as the letter contained detailed instructions for identifying the original owners and returning the property title to their descendants. She did not hesitate, immediately departing to deliver the document to the local magistrates, ensuring that the Thorne name would not only disappear from Blackwood, but that the harm they had caused would be formally and legally addressed. The letter was no longer a lost secret. It was the final instrument of justice she had been seeking to set her family's house in order. The submission of the letter to the authorities sent an irreversible shockwave through the town, as it proved that the Thorne treachery was not just a historical occurrence, but a continued, active effort by the children to protect their ill-gotten wealth. The revelation that the family had known the truth all along and had actively suppressed efforts at restitution destroyed any remaining sympathy for the siblings. The townspeople's mood hardened into a cold, focused resolve. They were no longer looking for an apology, but for the full legal seizure of the Thorne estate to provide restitution for the families who had been displaced. This truth acted as the final anchor for the town's collective destiny, effectively ending the period of uncertainty and initiating a formal process of community rebuilding. The Thorne influence, previously woven into the very structure of Blackwood's legal and economic systems, was systematically excised, ensuring that no remnant of their exploitative practices could survive into the next decade. The destiny of Blackwood was no longer tethered to the whims and avarice of a single, powerful family, but was finally becoming a communal project defined by fairness and shared responsibility. As the legal proceedings commenced, the town felt a collective, exhilarating sensation of release, knowing that the structural barriers that had kept them in subservience were finally being dismantled. The truth had not merely revealed the past, it had fundamentally rewritten the possibilities for the future, providing a clean slate that the community was eager to inhabit. Blackwood was changing, not by chance, but by the deliberate, informed choices of its people, who were finally reclaiming their agency from the shadows of a legacy they had been forced to endure for far too long. Facing immediate arrest and the absolute seizure of the manor, Julian Vane and Isolde Thorne made a final desperate attempt to flee Blackwood in the middle of a torrential downpour, abandoning all the luxuries they had once prized. Their carriage, heavily burdened with the few remaining valuables they had managed to conceal, became mired in the deep, waterlogged mud of the rural roads, forcing them to abandon the vehicle and continue on foot through the freezing rain. The flight was a pitiful spectacle. The two former architects of the town's misery reduced to nothing more than desperate fugitives, their fine clothing ruined and their dignity entirely absent. They were finally intercepted by the local constabulary at the edge of the border, their surrender marked not by the defiance they had projected for years, but by a hollow, pathetic submission that betrayed their complete collapse. The arrest was witnessed by several of the town's residents, who watched in a silence that was more powerful than any mocking shout, recognizing that the Thornes had become the architects of their own final destruction. The flight had been the final test of their resolve, and it had proven that without the armor of status and the silence of others, they were fundamentally incapable of sustaining their own survival. As they were led back toward Blackwood in chains, the storm broke, and a thin, weak ray of sunlight illuminated the path ahead, signaling the end of their influence and the beginning of the legal process that would see them held accountable for their actions. The desperate flight had served only to confirm their guilt, providing the authorities with the final, undisputed evidence of their intent to evade justice and continue their pattern of deceit. Blackwood was once again silent, not with the fear of the Thornes, but with the quiet, expectant peace of a town that had finally finished burying its own past. As the legal proceedings reached their conclusion, Julian and Isolde requested a final audience with Seraphina, hoping that a plea for mercy might mitigate the severe sentences that awaited them. Seraphina arrived at the holding cell, her expression devoid of the anger they expected, replaced instead by a profound, hollow indifference that signaled she had long ago moved past the need for their validation or their remorse. She listened to their disjointed, selfish justifications with a quiet detachment, recognizing that their desperation to be forgiven was merely another attempt to manipulate her into providing them with an escape from the consequences of their own choices. She informed them that forgiveness was a gift earned through genuine transformation and the acceptance of responsibility, neither of which they had demonstrated at any point during their long history of exploitation. Their pleas became increasingly frantic as they realized their final attempt to leverage their familial connection had failed, confirming that the bridge to their past life had been burned by their own hands. Seraphina turned to leave, leaving them in the cold silence of their cell, understanding that the only path toward true peace lay in acknowledging that some betrayals were too foundational to be reconciled with a simple, empty apology. The finality of the encounter left them utterly isolated, stripped of the last hope they had clung to as the mechanism of justice began to move toward its final verdict. There would be no restorative grace for those who had treated honor as a negotiable commodity, and Seraphina's departure was the final admission that the Thorne family was beyond redemption. They remained in the darkness, facing the reality that the only legacy they had managed to construct was one of total, self-inflicted exile from the lives of the few who might have once held them in regard. With the manor seized by the state, and the Thorne name officially stricken from the records of Blackwood, the grand estate was opened to the public for the first time, its opulent halls now serving as empty, silent reminders of a family that had effectively erased itself. The villagers wandered through the corridors, looking upon the gilded mirrors and velvet drapes not with envy, but with a clinical curiosity, as if examining the discarded shell of a parasite that had finally been extracted. The ruins of their life were no longer a source of intimidation. They were merely artifacts of a past that the town had successfully relegated to the history books, marking the transition from fear to a new collective agency. Seraphina returned to the manor one last time, not as its heiress, but as a visitor, observing the way the estate was being repurposed for community use, with plans already underway to turn the grounds into public farmland for the families who had once been displaced. She felt a strange, quiet satisfaction watching the transformation, recognizing that the space that had once symbolized her family's avarice was now contributing to the prosperity and restoration of the town's common folk. The ghostly remnants of her previous life were finally being subsumed by the vibrant, active future of Blackwood, effectively ensuring that the Thorne name would never again dictate the terms of anyone's existence. As the sun set over the transformed estate, she walked away, leaving the ruins of her ghostly life behind, without a single look of regret or desire. The mansion stood as a testament to the fact that power, when used to facilitate injustice, was inherently transient, and that the only enduring structures were those built on the genuine consent and participation of the community. She had reclaimed her future by letting go of the past, fully prepared to build a new life in a world that she had played a vital role in restoring to balance. The story of the Thorne family reached its final conclusion in the archives of Blackwood, where the recovered ledgers were now stored as part of the public record, serving as a permanent warning against the repetition of such systemic greed. The town flourished under a new, participatory governance, with the memory of the Thorne collapse serving as the foundational myth of their restored, community-led independence. Every aspect of Blackwood's daily life now reflected the hard-earned lessons of the past, ensuring that no individual could again attain the singular, unchecked power that had once brought the community to the brink of ruin. Seraphina and Kaelen, having both played their parts in the restoration of the town, began their separate journeys toward the horizon, their fates no longer tethered by the necessity of the Thorne downfall. They left Blackwood behind, carrying the knowledge that they had acted with honor when it was most difficult, and that their shared history had been transformed from a source of trauma into a foundation for a life defined by genuine agency and purpose. The history of the Thornes was now a closed chapter, silenced by the finality of their accountability and the strength of the community that had risen from the rubble of their decline. The town itself continued to evolve, the silence of the Thorne legacy now replaced by the vibrant, chaotic sound of a community building its own future, free from the shadows of the past. There were no grand statues to commemorate the downfall, nor any monuments to the Thorne name. There was only the quiet, enduring stability of a town that had finally reclaimed its own integrity. The history was complete, the debts were paid, and Blackwood remained as a testament to the power of truth to reclaim a future that had almost been permanently stolen. The Thorne collapse was absolute, but the story of Seraphina and Kaelen is only beginning as they forge their new lives. If you enjoyed this saga of honor and redemption, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and comment below. What was the most shocking moment of this journey?